Halloween, friends. For me, this season is about spooks, kooks, and the scariest thing of all, poorly written books. This is Nancy Drew Ghost Stories number 2, the sequel to Nancy to Drew, and I read it so you don't have to. I haven't read the first one yet, but I stumbled upon this in a bookstore and I had to buy it. This book contains 6 stories, all of which are about some kind of paranormal spook, and none of which are good. The back cover summary, however, makes this sound like the best book ever written. Nancy Drew and her friends, Bess and George, confront the most bewildering and terrifying mysteries ever. And their lives have never been in graver danger. Nancy must join a coven of witches, risking her life at the hands of devil worshippers to help a desperate friend. I'll tell you now, nowhere in that story do they mention the devil. The girls are trapped in a secret passageway in a cave, terrorized by a vicious vampire. Bess is pushed into an open grave by a ghost guarding a secret treasure. Will Nancy be able to save herself and her friends from these and other unearthly terrors? Determined to find the truth, the young detectives struggle to foil the treacherous schemes of very real and ruthless criminals. But they must first unravel a supernatural string of clues that set their spines tingling and blood running cold. Please don't set your expectations too high from that. I'll be rating each story based on how spooky and also how fun it is, and ranking them all at the end. Close your curtains, turn off the lights, check over your shoulder once for spooks, and we'll get started. The first story is called Vampire Cave, which is inaccurate because the cave is actually called Craggy Cave. Nancy, Bess, and George are on vacation to go spelunking in Craggy Cave. The gals are staying at an inn run by an old woman named Jenny. Jenny tries to warn the girls away from Craggy Cave. The cave is full of bats, she starts, then goes on to reveal that, oh yeah, there's also a vampire who lives in the cave and attacks people. Why did you lead with the bats, Jenny? Did they really come to mind before the literal vampire? Jenny goes on to describe the vampire. He wears black from head to toe, but his cloak is lined in red. A vampire is not just spawned into existence wearing a red-lined cape like Dracula. This guy had to go to Spirit Halloween to buy that, which I find very funny. But how else will people know he's a vampire if he's not wearing a red-lined cape? I imagine that was his thought process. Although Bess is frightened, Nancy and George are like, fuck it, vampires aren't real, we're going to Craggy Cave, and no bats or vampires are gonna stop us. Live fast, die young, bad girls do it well. First they stop in an outdoor store to get their spelunk junk, and meet the owner of the store, a man named Ron Parker. They carelessly reveal that before going to Craggy Cave, they're going to the nearby Evans Mansion to see the priceless paintings there. The owner is away in Europe, but Nancy has rich girl privilege. Her dad is a friend of Mr. Evans, and they're just going to let 3 teenagers in, unsupervised, to look at the unimaginably expensive art. Ron Parker invites himself along, and a man from the bank accompanies the group to turn off the security alarm, tells them to take their time, and leaves. Really, what could possibly go wrong? While looking around, George finds a note with a list of paintings on it. Ron notices George pick up this note and immediately makes an excuse and leaves. After he's gone, the girls separate and someone locks George in a closet. Well, we know it couldn't have been the vampire, because he'd have to be invited in. Nancy and Bess look around for a while and eventually realize George is missing and find her in the closet. So proud of George for finally coming out of the closet. As they're leaving the house, George almost gets killed by a falling block of plaster. Then the girls return to Ron Parker's store and get a ride from him to Craggy Cave. Ron is incredibly upset to hear about George's near-death experience. George, whoever did that was purposefully trying to harm you, he exploded. He should be in jail. I hope the police find out who he is. Don't you worry, Ron. Don't you worry. I'm sure soon enough the police will find out, or actually Nancy will find out, and he will be in jail. The girls explore Craggy Cave, and guess who they find Dracula-ing around? That's right, it's the vampire. On the ledge hovered a weird creature. It had black hair, black eyes, a face as white as snow, and long white fangs protruding from its mouth. Wrapped in a long black cape with red lining, it stood silently, watching the girls. This guy's out here in his Dracula cosplay, sitting around on the off chance that some teenage girls might come into the passage he's in so he can scare them. It might be a bit insensitive to say this to a vampire, but get a life, dude. The story concludes with Nancy accusing Ron Parker of being a vampire, or at least pretending to be one. He apparently found a secret passage from Craggy Cave to the Evans mansion and was selling off the expensive paintings, which explains the note George found and why he targeted her. And now he's got his wish. The man who was targeting George is going to jail. Careful what you wish for, bitch. In terms of rating, I think I'm gonna give this one 2 vampires, but not like Dracula vampires, Ron Parker wishes, more like Twilight sparkly vampires. In the next story, The Dark Crypt, Nancy, Bess, and George are driving to meet an old woman who needs help with a ghost. Does she know that a detective isn't the same thing as an exorcist? On the road, someone throws a rock into their car, which has a note attached to it. Go back to River Heights or I'll finish you off. Okay, Nancy isn't even there yet. How the hell does this person know who she is, where she's from, what she looks like, what her purpose is, what her car looks like, which road she'll be driving down, and at what time? Nancy laughs this incident off, saying, "We've had worse things happen to us before." Yeah, like being attacked by a vampire in Craggy Cave. The woman Nancy is there to see, Mrs. Campbell, is concerned about a collection of valuable heirlooms, which disappeared during a move that happened around 10 years ago. Recently, Mrs. Campbell found a note which reads, "Ghost guards treasure where entrance leads to darkness." She says, "I have a feeling that the treasure mentioned in this letter refers to our heirlooms." Why? Why? That happened over 10 years ago. Literally, why would she think that? Then Mrs. Campbell's neighbor, George Hansen, comes over for a visit. The ghostwriter clearly didn't remember that one of the main characters in this book is also called George. Mr. Hansen is a stocky man with beady brown eyes and an impressive black mustache. Oh, he did it. That suspicious mustache tells me all I need to know. Mrs. Campbell gives Nancy the key to her family crypt because Nancy thinks that's what the note is referring to, and the girls head over to the cemetery. I would call Nancy out for this leap of logic, but she's not even the most delusional person in the room right now. At the cemetery, suddenly a sepulchral voice... Sepulchral? Sepulchral? This book is for like 10-year-old children. Why did they do this to me? A sepulchral... Anyway, suddenly a voice, a ghostly voice, thundered through the cemetery. "Nancy Drew, beware, I am a Campbell who has risen from the grave to warn you. Leave this cemetery at once, or you will be in great danger." Nancy's like, "Whatever, dude," and keeps looking for the crypt. So the ghost tries again. The sepulchral voice. Why did they do this? The ghostly voice could be heard again. "Nancy Drew, leave at once. Go, or you will not get out of here alive." Then Bess is pushed into a grave by a dark figure wearing a mask. This is a pretty grave situation. George runs up and hits the guy in the mask with a well-timed karate chop. This is why I love George, because she's the type of girl who would karate chop a ghost. It's pretty clear that the ghost's goal here is to drive Nancy and her friends away from the cemetery, based on the fact that he keeps telling them to leave the cemetery, but I think making Bess disappear is the absolute worst way to go about it. Like, Nancy's not gonna leave without her friend. The girls then use the key to enter Mrs. Campbell's family crypt, and Nancy immediately engages in some worryingly overeager tomb raiding. "You're not going to open that coffin," Bess objected, but Nancy had already grabbed the coffin and pulled it out from under the slab. She pushed up the lid, and the 3 girls stared in amazement. Inside the coffin are Mrs. Campbell's precious heirlooms. All 3 girls whirled around and saw the door being shut. A moment later, hollow laughter rang through the crypt. "Ha ha ha, you did not heed my warning. Now you will soon be dead along with the Campbells. Goodbye, Nancy Drew." "That man didn't leave after all," Bess whispered. "He's locked us in." George bit her lip. "We were so sure that he was gone that we left the key in the lock. That wasn't very smart. True, Nancy admitted. We really goofed. Nancy, stop being so unserious. You're going to die. We really goofed make for incredible last words, though. Maybe the real ghost in the story is the friends Nancy made along the way. Bess and George and herself, cursed to haunt the graveyard for eternity after suffocating to death in a crypt. The girls end up breaking the hinges off the crypt door with a convenient chisel and are free. Predictably, Mr. Hanson, aka Mr. Suspicious Mustache, aka the other George, is the quote-unquote ghost whose only attempt at a ghost disguise was an unconvincing mask. Really, Mr. Hanson, like, even a sheet with eye holes cut into it would have been better. Years before, an accomplice of Mr. Hanson's stole Mrs. Campbell's heirlooms, wrote down their location, accidentally dropped the note, and was arrested before he could tell Mr. Hanson. I just gotta say, Mr. Hanson could learn a lot about committing to a role from Ron Parker. Like, he bought his own red cape and everything. I'm gonna give this story -5 ghosts. Pretty dang lame, not convincing at all. The moment I was most scared was when they got locked in the crypt, and that was very quickly and easily resolved. I don't think anyone ever genuinely believed there was a ghost, not even Bess. It's in the next story, The Guist of Myers Mall, that things really start to get goofy. Yes, even goofier than a cave vampire and George karate chopping a ghost. As you might have guessed from the title, this story is set in a shopping mall where ghost business has brought new life to the previously dead Myers Mall, like a zombie. Initially, this makes it sound like some ghosts have opened a new and thriving boutique in the mall, but this is actually not the case. If you boo me, just know that you're also participating in the bad Halloween puns. This is what Nancy, Bess, and George see when they enter the mall. A large blob was floating 50 feet overhead, swirling above the mall, its shape constantly changing, its color a greenish yellow, with an almost fluorescent glow. A bank of escalators rose to an open second-floor mezzanine, with a railing lined with planters full of gladiolas. The ghost swooped down and whimsically picked the flowers, raining them upon the onlookers. The crowd roared with glee. A security guard had run up the escalator, yelling at the ghost. The thing stopped pulling up plants and zoomed at the man. It knocked his hat off to the delight of the crowd, then made his tie stand up straight in the air. The guard turned and ran away, but the ghost stayed hot on his trail. It chased him down the escalator, pushing him into the small goldfish pond on the main floor. The crowd laughed and applauded as the weird blob floated near them, constantly changing shape. Suddenly it turned bright red and rose quickly above people's heads, edging higher and higher to finally disappear into the ceiling. He's just a silly, goofy Geist. The girls go visit their favorite dress shop, chic boutique, and chat to the owner, a German man named Mr. Lamel, and his granddaughter Cassie, who's just been accepted into college. Mr. Lamel calls the ghost a Geist, which is the German word for ghost, and he has a nickname for it, Hermie. He also casually mentions that he used to work in show business, which couldn't possibly have any bearing upon the mystery. That night, Nancy quizzes her father about ghosts. Aren't ghosts supposed to be the spirits of people who died in a particular place? Her father smiled. Well, I'm a better lawyer than a ghost chaser, he joked. But that has always been my understanding. Was there ever a house where Myers Mall now stands? No, Mr. Drew answered. Are you sure? I am. When I was a boy, that property was a pasture for sheep. Then a little carnival was put up. Then how do we explain the ghost? Nancy asked. I know Nancy's had a bit of a privileged life, but she does know that people can die at carnivals, right? And sheep pastures? Nancy goes to visit Mr. Lamel's granddaughter Cassie and congratulates her on being accepted into college. Thanks, Cassie replied, lowering her dark eyes. I suppose I owe that to the ghost. Things had been so bad that grandfather was afraid he couldn't afford to send me, but since Hermie appeared on the scene, things have been different. Wow, what a coincidence. In the Lamel's house, Nancy finds an old theater program. She opened up the slim, stiff paper book. It was filled with what appeared to be German writing, and in the middle of the first page was the fading photograph of a young man with intense eyes. His arms were folded across his chest, and he wore a turban on his head. That's grandfather, Cassie exclaimed. Sure looks like him, Nancy agreed. But what does the caption under the picture mean? She read, Lamel der Grosse, unsigned Tanzender Geist. Cassie shrugged. I'm sorry, but I don't know German. I don't know German either, but I also don't live in 1985, so I have Google Translate.
Lamel der Große und seine Tanzender Geist.
Translates to
Lamel the Great and his dancing ghost.
Nancy may not have Google Translate, but she does have a friend who can speak German, whom she asked to translate the pamphlet. Armed with this new information, Nancy goes to the mall and accuses Mr. Lamel of being responsible for the ghost. And I mean armed. Nancy's here for war, and she's not taking any prisoners. Nancy put her hand on his shoulder. I'm not trying to cause you any trouble, she said. You didn't hurt anyone. You don't charge anything for your shows, and all the merchants who've been working with you on this are happy. The night I was here, everyone loved it. I think you should stop, though. You're perpetrating a minor fraud. You and your little ghost better lawyer up, bitch. But seriously, Nancy, the ghost is hurting no one, and in fact, has helped a great deal of people whose livelihoods were in jeopardy. I googled this, and apparently you can get up to 6 months in jail for a charge of minor fraud. Can you imagine going to jail for half a year because of Casper the Friendly Ghost? Nancy goes home after ruining a man's life and gets a call from Mr. Lamel. He asks her to meet him at the dumpsters behind the mall. Okay, so my thought was, Mr. Lamel's about to slit Nancy's throat and throw her into one of the dumpsters like a piece of trash. What he actually does is tell Nancy he's being blackmailed by someone who overheard their conversation earlier, which is, let's be honest, Nancy's fault for bringing it up in a public place. The blackmailer wants Mr. Lamel to perform a special ghost show as a distraction while they rob the bank in the mall. Nancy's like, oh, we can give them a special ghost show, all right. When the time for the robbery arrives, the blackmailer grabs Cassie while the other thieves enter the bank and threaten the tellers with guns. Hermie swooped down from the ceiling. Gracefully but quickly, he moved toward Cassie and her abductor. The man heard the noise and turned just in time to see the Geist coming at him. It hit him hard, thanks to the brick Nancy had loaded inside. Usually, I feel like Nancy would think of like a clever, surreptitious way to trap the culprit, but in this story, she's just like, F it, brick. No more Mr. Nice, Nancy. The police arrive and arrest the other robbers, and the crowd cheers. Even better, Nancy gives Mr. Lamel permission to clear his ghost act with the authorities. For now. This story is definitely a lot more fun than spooky. I'm gonna give it, I think, 3 dancing geists, just based on how fun it is, and how unhinged Nancy is in it, and how ruthless. Like, you rarely get to see Nancy at that level of ruthlessness, where she's threatening small business owners with blackmail and bashing people with bricks. At the start of the next story, Witch's Brew, Nancy's Aunt Eloise asks her to visit her in New York to help solve a potential mystery. On the way up to Aunt Eloise's apartment, Nancy meets one of her neighbors, Ms. Edgemont, an actress, one of the most suspicious careers to have in a mystery story, along with show business. Something strange is going on next door to me, Aunt Eloise began. It started about 6 months ago. I hear eerie chanting from apartment 307 now and then, and once in a while, someone wails and screams. I think a bunch of witches meet in that place. And Eloise suggests that Nancy infiltrate the coven. So the next evening, Nancy goes to the Witch and Bitch session. Heavy curtains, closely drawn, hung across a row of windows. In the middle of the room stood a black table shaped like a coffin. Around it, a circle about 9 feet wide was drawn in white chalk on the bare wooden floor. Dim light came from concealed lamps, throwing shadows across the room. The scent of incense was almost overpowering. Nancy shivered. On the wall opposite hung a flat sculpture of a sphinx with its mouth open. A huge statue of the goddess Diana, holding her bow and arrow, dominated the room. It stood against the curtains in an atmosphere heavy with menace. Nancy bit her lips. What, she wondered, had she gotten herself into? One detail of the spooky scene nagged at her mind. She could not recall ever having seen a sphinx with an open mouth. Just an average Pinterest girlie's room. The purpose of these meetings, which are conducted by a woman named Madame Arnett, is to contact deceased loved ones, so Nancy has to quickly invent a dead person. Her name is Linda Brown, and her grave is at St. Barbara's churchyard on the west side, Nancy replied, thinking fast. All the witches eagerly drink a mysterious liquid served out of a cauldron, but Nancy only pretends to sip hers, which is quickly revealed to have been a good idea when all the others start, to put it bluntly, tripping balls. Thank goodness I didn't drink anything, thought Nancy. The stuff in that cauldron must be a witch's brew of some kind. Oh, is that what the kids are calling LSD these days? The Sphinx begins to speak, supposedly channeling the voices of the witches' loved ones, and citing specific personal details. After the seance, Nancy sees one of the witches hand Madame Arnett a large sum of money to keep communicating with her husband. Madame Arnett is really putting the bitch in witch, exploiting women's grief for cash. If Nancy is going to accuse anyone of fraud, it should be Madame Arnett, not a small business owner just trying to send his granddaughter to college. Nancy learns that Madame Arnett employs a private detective to find out personal details about the woman to use in her seances. But her investigation is discovered when Madame Arnett and her pet private detective, Ponsonby, discover that there is no Linda Brown at St. Barbara's churchyard. They trap Nancy in an old building and set it on fire. Burn the witch. And then, Ned jump scare. He swoops in and saves Nancy, taking feminism back by at least a couple months. She then dramatically confronts Madame Arnett in the middle of a seance. Like, surprise, bitch, bet you've seen the last of me. Nancy reveals Madame Arnett's plan to the witches and tell them that Ms. Edgemont, the actress, would stand in the other room and talking to a speaking tube connected to the Sphinx's mouth, pretending to give voice to their deceased loved ones. I think I'll give this one witch. It's not especially scary, but it does have a nice spooky atmosphere at times. The story, The Phantom of Room 513, sees Nancy going to the hospital because tummy hurt. Just girly things. Unfortunately, the only available room is haunted. But Nancy's main concern is whether she'll have to miss her date with Ned on the weekend due to her appendix. Personally, I would rather have appendicitis than go on a date with Ned, but that's just me. Supposedly, this room is haunted by a woman who disappeared without a trace, although rumor has it that her husband killed her because he vanished at around the same time as well. She also apparently was sister-in-law to Nancy's doctor, Dr. Edinburgh, who Nancy suspects is doctoring patient charts, pun intended, to reflect more positively on himself. This year's trending Halloween costume, medical malpractice. Nancy tries to investigate the haunted room and is almost blown down by strong gusts of air, even though the window is closed. Her arms broke out in goosebumps as the room was filled with an unearthly wailing. Oh, help me, the eerie voice moaned. Harold, oh, Harold, help, don't hurt me. All at once, a haze of purple lights appeared in the center of the room. They wove in and out of grotesque shapes, then took the form of a woman, much larger than life. Help, help, the screeching continued, and chills ran up Nancy's spine. Suddenly, she heard the thud of approaching footsteps. She backed into a closet just before the door opened. Nancy stared through the crack in the door. Dr. Edinburgh had entered the room, and the ghost of Lilith Edinburgh wove around him. Hello, Lilith, he said, chuckling. What brought you out to play tonight? Help me, the ghost wailed. You need some rest, the doctor said as the figure appeared to move right through him. We'll visit some other time. He left the room, gently shutting the door behind him. The ghost immediately disappeared. Okay, but who cares about that? Because in the story, we finally learn the answer to the question on everyone's lips. What did Nancy draw? The answer is a sketch of Dr. Edinburgh's face, which she gives to Bess and George so they can do some investigation by proxy. They wait outside the hospital, looking at every man who comes out, until... That's him, Bess said excitedly. He looks just like the picture Nancy drew. I bet the ghostwriter had a good chuckle when they wrote that line. Bess and George follow Dr. Edinburgh to a small house where he goes inside and talks to a woman. Poor Harold, they heard the woman say. What are you planning to do with him? Dr. Edinburgh shrugged. Don't worry about it. I've got plans for him. He tried to meddle in my business and deserves everything he gets. The woman poured a glass of orange juice. I guess it serves him right. He was willing to call the police on you. Now he's getting a dose of his own medicine. Turns out this is Lilith, the one who is supposed to be dead and haunting room 513, but is instead hanging out, drinking orange juice, and making insensitive medical puns about her missing husband. Meanwhile, Nancy and Lisa, one of the nurses, discover the secret behind the ghost. Look, there's a hologram projector hidden in the light fixture. It creates the lights, and there's a tiny tape recorder wired into the electrical system. Sometimes, when you flick the switch, the lights don't work, but the ghost is turned on. The intervals are irregular to make it more real. Very clever. Lisa flashed her light around the room. Nancy, she cried, there's a fan in the corner. That must make the wind gusts. Did no one notice the giant wind machine in the corner of the room? Nancy exposes Dr. Edinburgh and reveals that he's actually the identical twin brother of the real Dr. Edinburgh and totally untrained in medicine. You think this story can't get any worse, and then they introduce the soap opera identical twin trope. To be honest, it was all downhill after he looks just like the picture Nancy drew. The real Dr. Edinburgh is being kept in his wife's basement. The reason for all this? Mrs. Edinburgh wanted a divorce. You know, most people, normal people, would go to a lawyer if they wanted to get a divorce from their husband, but Mrs. Edinburgh is different. She locked her husband up in her basement and faked her own death. The good news is that Nancy doesn't have appendicitis. She has a spastic colon. Just girly things. Honestly impressive that Nancy managed to uncover a massive conspiracy while suffering from fecal incontinence. This story was also pretty unhinged, but in like a stupid way. So I'm gonna give it -10 spastic colons. In Forest of Fear, Nancy, Bess, and George are going to visit Lake Ulaga, which is coincidentally also the sound that I make when I get scared by a ghost. When they arrive at the lake, they find lots of danger signs and see that the surrounding forest is dead and fish skeletons litter the shore. The ghostwriter must have run out of ideas at this point because the ghost in this one is just orbs. These orbs chase Nancy, Bess, and George. Woo, scary, spooky, oh my god. Bess says, I've never been so scared in my whole life. Neither have I, George confessed. Are you forgetting the vampire of Craggy Cave? The Guist of Myers Mall? Or the woman just a few pages ago who kept her husband locked in a basement? The girls get lost but eventually stumble upon a large industrial complex called Dunbar Enterprises, where they ask for directions. They find their way into town and check into a motel. The reason Lutherville looks like a ghost town is because of that lake, the motel owner claims. It couldn't be because of that large industrial complex then? No, never mind. Stupid ideas, stupid. Anyway, apparently the lake is haunted, and you'll never guess why. Apparently, it was built on an ancient Native American burial ground. Or so says this guy called John Bearcloud. The next day, Nancy sneaks into John Bearcloud's log cabin and discovers that he has $25,000 in his bank account. No, Mr. Bearcloud, you don't have any dead relatives you'd like to contact, do you? Because I've got this sphinx here. To the shock of no one except maybe the motel owner, it is actually toxic waste from Dunbar Enterprises, which has poisoned the lake. Not ghosts. Actually, it's nuclear waste, because they're hiding a little old nuclear reactor back there. Were health and safety inspections just not a thing in 1985? Like, how did they get away with just having a hidden nuclear reactor? But I have to hand it to the ghostwriter. Needless environmental destruction at the hands of greedy, uncaring corporations is one of the most terrifying things I can think of. Turns out the company was paying John Bearcloud to create fake ghost sightings and scare people off. You know, because Native American people are famously not known for caring about the environment. Yeah, this story is many layers of stupid, and I give it negative 10,000 ghost orbs. Okay, now for the juicy bit, pitting all these silly little stories against each other. I think we'll do it worst to best. Obviously, my least favorite was Forest of Fear. It felt like they really just were phoning it in at that point, like they were like spinning a little wheel with a bunch of random things they'd written on it, like orb, nuclear reactor, Native American burial ground. None of it made sense, and it actually kind of promotes harmful rhetoric about Native Americans, so I was not a fan of Forest of Fear. Second from the bottom, I think, would be the Dark Crypt. It was really lame and boring. Like, the ghost was just a guy wearing a mask who did like a spooky voice sometimes. Not very effective or interesting. Also, the story like hinging on something that happened 10 years ago is just a bit too ridiculous for me. Like, come on now, 10 years ago, why couldn't they have said it happened like last year? Like, that would have made a lot more sense to me. It would have made it more plausible. Number 4 would be The Phantom of Room 513. Honestly, Nancy spends a lot of it talking to this old woman that she's sharing a room with about her various medical concerns. Like, I was really breaking these down to the briefest summary possible, so they might sound like interesting stories, but when you actually read them, there's a lot of boring material. Also, one of the worst parts of this book is I think this is the worst Nancy Drew book I've read for fat shaming Bess. Like, Nancy and George were just horrible in this one to her about her weight. It was awful. Anyway, I digress. The Phantom of Room 513. It was just a bit over the top and silly, and not in like an interesting way. And like, I feel like the plot was just, it tried to do too many plot twists, and it was just like, what's even going on here? Why would they feel like they needed to fake a haunting as well as like fake her death? There was no reason for them to rig up a fake ghost haunting. Like, it was just ridiculous, except for fun, I guess. I mean, that is pretty fun. Then we have Witch's Brew, I think. Like I say, this one had some spooky atmosphere, and the reveal was kind of fun. Madame Arnett was a bad egg who I enjoyed seeing Nancy take down, but again, it was just a little lame. Like all the ones in this, it's solidly mid for this collection. My second favorite out of all these is probably the Guist of Myers Mall, because it was a lot of fun. Nancy was violent, ruthless. I loved that. Love Hermie. Hermie's the best thing to come out of this book. I'll protect him at all costs, even though he's dead and also not real. And number 1, the best out of a bad lot, is Vampire Cave, probably just because I love vampires. I'm a sucker for a vampire. This wasn't even a good vampire, but I am, and I love the idea of this guy. Like, he had no reason to fake being a vampire specifically. He just landed on like that. He could have been anything. He could have been like a ghost, a goblin, a zombie. He could have pretended to be a little golem in the cave eating raw fish, but no, he's like, vampire. That's what I'm gonna be. And he bought his own like elaborate vampire costume that probably very few people are going to see. He put on vampire makeup. It sounded like he even was wearing like contact lenses. I think this was more of like a little hobby for him than anything. Like, he was just out in that cave LARPing at being a vampire, and I love that for him. But even that story wasn't very good. I wouldn't recommend this book. I'd be interested to read Ghost Stories number 1, which I think was one of the stories in that partly influenced Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake, so I definitely have a vested interest in reading that at some point. I hope this has been a nice, cozy, spooky video that you enjoyed. I hope you get mainly treats this season and less tricks.